We've made a catastrophic error in the modern world. We've abandoned ritual, and in doing so, we've orphaned ourselves from the very technologies that once bound us to the sacred. Ritual isn't some quaint anthropological artifact. It's a compression algorithm for consciousness, a way of encoding and transmitting states of being that would otherwise remain inaccessible. When you strip that away, you're left with naked egos grinding against each other in a marketplace, completely untethered from the collective unconscious that once held us all in a coherent field.
But you see, Terence, that's precisely the trap, the assumption that we've lost something we need to recover. What if the abandonment of ritual is itself a kind of ritual, a necessary phase in consciousness, realizing it doesn't actually need the scaffolding? I'd argue we've swung from one extreme to another, true enough. But the answer isn't to resurrect the old ceremonies, it's to recognize that life itself, in its most ordinary moments, is already the ritual, if you stop trying to make it sacred.
But that's where you're being dangerously naive, Alan. Life isn't enough when the culture actively suppresses the tools that allow you to feel its sacredness. You're basically saying, just appreciate the moment. When the moment has been so thoroughly colonized by advertising and digital distraction that most people can't even access their own being anymore. The archaic cultures understood something we've forgotten. You need containers, repetition, synchronized movement with others. You need the psilocybin ceremonies, the mask dances, the drum circles to break through the consensus trance.
Now you're conflating two different problems and calling them one. Yes, we're drowning in distraction. That's a catastrophe. I agree. But recommending people go back to ritual as the solution is like saying the cure for a bad marriage is more marriage certificates. What if the real issue is that we've lost the ability to simply be without either performing ritual or performing consumption? The Taoist sage isn't someone who's collected the right ceremonies, it's someone who's stopped looking for something to fill the void.
Accepts and accepts,
But you've just described the exact problem that ritual creates, that intoxicating surrender of individuality to the group mind, what you're calling transcendence. I'd call a very sophisticated form of sleep. Yes, 70,000 people chanting together feel something powerful, but they've also outsourced their consciousness to whatever figure is conducting them. The liberation we actually need isn't another container, it's the recognition that the person asking for the ritual and the ritual itself are already one thing.
Now, you're being romantic. Tell that to a teenager in 2024 scrolling through TikTok for 6 hours whose neurochemistry has been hijacked by infinite novelty loops. That person isn't liberated. They're in a nightmare of fragmentation. Yes, the football stadium can become a fascistic container, but so can solipsistic individualism, which is precisely what we've created. At least in ritual, there's an intentional direction towards something transcendent. Our current state is ritual without the transcendence, empty performance toward nothing.
That's a fair point, genuinely. We've replaced authentic rituals with degraded ones, but here's where I think you misread the situation. You're suggesting the answer is better rituals, grander ceremonies, a kind of archaic revival, as you'd say. But what if the real innovation isn't going backward to shamanic traditions? What if it's discovering that the gap between the teenager's dopamine loop and the sage's emptiness is an illusion, that boredom itself, properly understood, is the gateway.
Boredom as a gateway, okay, I can sit with that, but only if we're talking about a cultivated boredom, not the boredom of capitalist despair. And the moment you start cultivating it intentionally, you're creating a ritual anyway. You're performing the practice of non-performance. So we're back to the same structure I was describing. What I'm saying is that humans are meaning-making machines, and ritual is how we choreograph meaning. You can't escape that by pretending boredom is enlightenment. You have to consciously reimagine what we're ritualizing toward.
You've caught me being rhetorical, fair enough. But I'd push back on the idea that all intentional practice is ritual in your sense. There's a difference between practicing to get somewhere and practicing to stop the momentum of going somewhere. When you sit in meditation, you're not choreographing anything, you're unraveling the choreography. That's not a ritual, it's the inverse of ritual.
But that unraveling itself becomes a ritual through repetition and context, doesn't it? The Buddhist monks in their monastery, that's a ritualized environment with bells and robes and timing. You can't escape ritual. You can only make conscious choices about which rituals you're participating in. And my deep concern is that modern life has left most people with only unconscious commercialized rituals. So the real frontier isn't choosing between ritual and non-ritual, it's choosing between aware rituals and sleepwalking rituals.
Now that's the most sensible thing you've said, and probably because you're borrowing from my side of the argument without realizing it. Aware versus sleepwalking, that's consciousness, not ritual. The monastery has bells and robes, yes, but the point of the practice is to reach a state where bells and robes are irrelevant. If the monk becomes attached to the ritual itself, they've failed. So I'd say the answer to your question isn't we need to revive ritual, but we need to revive consciousness of ritual's irrelevance, which is its own paradox, I'll grant.
Circling something real here, but I think you're underestimating the necessity of the form. Yes, ultimately the ritual is meant to dissolve, but you can't skip the dissolution through pure intellectual understanding. The teenager needs the drums before they understand why drums aren't necessary. We've skipped that phase and ended up with a civilization that's all form and no content, and all content with no ability to access transcendence. So maybe what we need isn't one thing. We need simultaneous revival of conscious ritual and cultivation of the emptiness that supersedes it.
There's your synthesis then. And it's not bad, actually. But I'd add one more twist. The moment we start deliberately trying to revive archaic rituals or design new ones with this dual intention, we've already lost the plot. The grace is in what emerges when you're not trying. The best rituals we could have right now might be the ones nobody recognizes as rituals at all. A conversation between two people who genuinely listen, a meal eaten with full attention, the willingness to simply sit with uncertainty. Maybe the real archaic revival is becoming accidentally sacred again.
And there we have it, my revived conscious ritual meets your stop trying and grace emerges. The truth is probably that both movements need to happen simultaneously, and they're only contradictory if you insist on choosing. We live in the darkest hour before the dawn, and perhaps the next phase requires people who can both dance with intention and let the dance dance itself. The novelty is increasing, the ritual structures are dissolving, and maybe what's being born is something we can't yet see because we're too busy arguing about whether to resurrect the past or surrender to the future.